Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence in Memphis, Tennessee. And one day I got a letter from a lady in Australia, and she said she wanted to celebrate grandfather's birthday by organizing a banquet, and she wanted to serve all his favorite dishes. And so she wrote to me to send all the recipes of his favorite dishes to her. And I said, if you serve what he ate, nobody is ever going to come to your banquet. Because his food was very strange food. He didn't eat for taste, he ate for nutrition. And so everything was put in one pot and boiled without salt and spices. And he just ate that, and nobody else could ever eat that kind of food. But it's very interesting because all of us celebrate birthdays, and we celebrate his birthday, but he never celebrated his birthday at all. And when he was alive, whenever anybody wanted to celebrate his birthday, he would say no. He said, there are so many people in the world who are dying of hunger and starvation, and I don't want any celebrations of birthday. And if you want to spend any money on celebrations, give that money to me so I can feed all the poor people. That was his whole idea of birthday and celebrations there. But I was very fortunate, as you were told in the introduction, to have lived with him for 2 years, to the last 2 years of his life, and learned a lot from him during that period. And I won't say that I was so bright that I could understand what he was teaching me at that age, but he had a way of teaching that remained with you. And as I grew up and began to reflect on it, I realized how important all these messages were. And as you said in the introduction, I grew up in South Africa, and I suffered a lot of prejudice there. And I was very angry, and I wanted eye for an eye justice. I wanted to be able to fight back again, so it became an obsession with me, and I started going to the gymnasium and pumping iron and doing exercises, and wanted to be big and strong so that I could fight back again. And that's when my parents decided it was time to go to India and give me the opportunity to live with grandfather. And the first lesson that he taught me was about understanding anger and being able to use that energy constructively. He said anger is like electricity. It is just as useful and just as powerful, but only if we use it intelligently. But it can be just as deadly and destructive if we abuse it. So just as we channel electrical energy and bring it into our lives and use it for the good of humanity, we must learn to channel anger in the same way so that we can use that energy for the good of humanity rather than abuse it and cause grief. He suggested that I write an anger journal. He said every time you get angry about something, don't act on it, don't say anything or do anything that you're going to regret later on. But put it all down in your journal. But write the journal with the intention of finding a solution to the problem, and then commit yourself to finding a solution. Now that is very important, because today a lot of people tell me they have been writing an anger journal for a long time, but it hasn't really helped them, because every time they go back and read the journal, they are just reminded of the incident and they get angry all over again. So we don't want the journal to be a reminder of the incident. We want the journal to help us find a solution to the problem. So it's very important that you write it with the intention of finding a solution, and then commit yourself to finding a solution. I did this for many years. Then I found that I was able to channel anger constructively and intelligently for the good rather than abusing it. And I think one of the reasons that I've dedicated my life now to going and sharing all these lessons and messages with young people is because I want to channel that anger that I felt against discrimination into positive action and make people realize that we are all human beings. Wherever we come from or whatever our color or size or gender, whatever it is, we are all human beings. We are all here together to make this world a better place. We are not here to fight each other and destroy each other and divide the world. We are here to create a world. And that is what our whole concept should be. And but after learning this profound lesson from grandfather, I was 12 years old at the time, and I wanted to see whether he himself had learned the lesson or not, and I decided to test him. And this was the time in his life when he was involved in many important things. He was not only fighting for India's independence, but he was also concerned about the emancipation of the Indian women, the education of children, the emancipation of the so-called untouchable people in India, the low caste. All of these issues were very high in his agenda. And he had programs going on in all these different fields. And of course, all these programs needed funding. And so he realized that the easiest way for him to raise money was to sell his autograph. So every morning and evening when he held his public prayer meetings, which were ecumenical prayers where we sang prayers from all the major religions of the world together, and we would sit in an auditorium like this without any religious symbols and pray in all the different religions. And then all the people, most of the people rather, would want his autograph. And by then everybody knew that they had to pay for the autograph. So while I was living with him, it was my duty to go out into the audience and collect the autograph books and the money and bring it to him for his signature. And one day I thought to myself, if everybody could get his autograph, why not me? After all, I'm his grandson and I deserve an autograph too. But I didn't have any money and my parents were not there with me, so I got myself a little autograph book and I slipped it into the file, hoping that he wouldn't notice the absence of money in it. But when he came to that book, he said, "Why is there no money for this autograph?" I said, "Because it's my book." And he said, "Well, you should know that I don't make an exception even for grandsons. And if you want an autograph, you not only have to pay me for it, but you'll have to earn the money and pay me. Don't ask your parents for it." And I said, "No way. So you're my grandfather and I'm going to make you give me this autograph for you." So he said, "All right, let's see who wins." And from that day, every day when he was in high-level political discussions with high-level politicians there, I would barge into the room with my autograph book and thrust it in his face and demand an autograph. My logic was that just to get rid of me, he would sign the book and give it to me. But every time I became too boisterous, all he did was put his hands across my mouth, press my head against his chest, and went on talking politics. He never, ever told me to get out of the room and leave him alone. On many occasions, the other politicians used to get exasperated and tell grandfather, why don't you give him the autograph? He disturbs our meetings every day. And he would just smile and say, this is a private joke between the two of us. You don't have to get involved. Well, the long and short of it is that he never did give me the autograph. And he never ever screamed at me to get out of the room and leave him alone, as we would do with our children. When they come into the room and we are very busy, we tell them sometimes, get out, can't you see I'm busy this now? He never ever did that to me. And that's when I realized that if he could control his anger to that extent, if we try to achieve 50% of it, we will make a tremendous difference in the level of violence that we experience today. Harvard University recently did a study, and they came to the conclusion that as much as 85% of the violence that we experience in our lives, personally as well as in the lives of our nations, is generated by anger. 85%. So if we reduce that by 50%, imagine the level of violence that would go down here. So it's very important for us to understand anger and not deny it. You know, today we deny anger. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to teach it. We just allow children to find their own ways of dealing with anger. And yet anger is a very powerful emotion. Anger to the human being is what fuel is to the automobile. If you don't put fuel in the automobile, it's not going to run. If we don't have anger, we won't be motivated to do anything. But unfortunately, because we don't pay any attention to anger, we end up abusing anger instead of using it intelligently. So learning about anger and teaching it is a very important part of his philosophy of nonviolence. But I also understood his philosophy, the depth and breadth of his philosophy of nonviolence, through another little incident. I was coming back from my tuitions, it was in Pune where we were staying because his grandfather was undergoing nature cure for his blood pressure. And I was walking home from my tuitions, and I had this little pencil in my hand. It was about 3 inches long. And I thought I deserve a better pencil. This is too small for me to use. And without a second thought, I just threw the pencil away because I was so sure grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I met grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small and where did I throw it away and why did I throw it away and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, you must be joking. I said, you don't expect me to look for a little pencil in the dark? He said, oh yes, I do. Here's a flashlight. And I went out and I must have searched for it for about 2 hours, or at least it seemed like 2 hours. But when I found it and brought it to him, I thought he would agree with me that it was too small to use. But instead he said, no, this is still perfectly good to be used until you couldn't hold it anymore. But then he made me sit and learn 2 very important lessons. He said, even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world, and because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty, and that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we overconsume and destroy and throw away because we have so much of it, that every time we do any of those things, we are contributing to violence in society. And to make me understand this lesson thoroughly, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence, just as you would do a family tree, with violence as the grandparent, and passive violence and physical violence as the two branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to analyze and examine everything that I had experienced during the day. Things that I may have done to other people or people may have done to me. Everything had to be analyzed and examined and put in their appropriate places on that tree. If it was the kind of violence where physical force is used, all the kicking and beating and punching and murders and rapes and wars and all of these things where physical violence is used would go under physical violence. But if it's the kind of violence where we don't use any physical violence, and yet we hurt people by the way we behave or the way we destroy things or overconsume things, discrimination, looking down on people, all the things that we do, and there are hundreds of things that we do every day which hurt people somewhere or the other. And that is passive violence. And when I began to do this introspection, I was amazed that within a few months, I was able to fill up a whole wall in my room with acts of passive violence. The physical violence didn't grow very much because there's a limit to what you can do physically. But the passive violence grew endlessly. And that's when I became aware of how much passive violence I was committing. I read in the New York Times a couple of months ago that in the United States alone, we throw away $160 billion worth of food every year. $160 billion worth of food just goes into the garbage every year. And yet in the United States, we have millions of people who go to bed hungry. Now that is a very serious form of passive violence. And imagine if the United States is throwing away that much food, how much food is being thrown away all over the world by every nation. And yet half of the world's population live in poverty and starvation and hunger. And these are the acts of passive violence that we don't take any note of. I mean, we don't even think of passive violence as being any kind of violence. And when I did this introspection and filled up that whole wall, then he explained to me the connection between the two. He said, we commit passive violence every day, consciously and unconsciously. And that generates anger in the victim. And the victim then resorts to physical violence to get justice. Because that's what justice has come to mean today. You got to make somebody pay for what they have done to us. It's about revenge. Our whole justice system everywhere in the world is about revenge. We want somebody to pay for what they have done to us. And yet, justice should not be revenge. It should be reformation. we should be trying to reform the people who did something wrong, not just punish them and throw them into the prison.